Grief is supposed to follow something that actually ends, a death, a divorce, a goodbye. It's supposed to be kind of we'll say public enough to be recognized, structured enough to be named, definitive enough to justify tears. But the grief that settles into many autism-affected marriages doesn't follow an ending. It follows a slow realization. And because nothing officially ends, no one brings flowers or sympathy cards. It's like grieving something that still exists. So one of the most disorienting aspects of this experience is that you're grieving a relationship that is technically intact. You may still share a home, still share responsibilities, still share routines, still sit across from each other at dinner. From the outside, nothing looks broken, right? And yet inside you, something has definitely collapsed. You're grieving not the presence of your partner, but the absence of emotional intimacy and emotional reciprocity, right? The absence of being fully met, the absence of what you once believed would grow naturally over time. So this kind of grief has no ceremony, so it remains invisible. It's experiencing a loss that no one else sees. You're not grieving dramatic betrayal, you're not grieving abuse, you're not grieving cruelty, but you are grieving what never quite materialized. The conversations that didn't deepen, the vulnerability that didn't build, the emotional synchrony that didn't develop. What you're grieving is the potential that never arrived. And potential is one of the hardest things to mourn because it never existed in tangible form. There's no evidence to point to, only contrast. And maybe you didn't even allow yourself to feel it. Most women don't even immediately recognize this as grief. They interpret it as frustration, disappointment, loneliness. Grief just feels too big for something that hasn't officially ended. And you may tell yourself, well, it's not that bad, or other people have it worse, or he's not a bad man, this is just marriage. And so you kind of suppress the grief before it fully forms. But suppressed grief doesn't disappear, unfortunately. It kind of settles into your body. Have you ever wondered how invisible grief shows up? Well, when grief is not acknowledged, it often expresses itself indirectly. You may notice a quiet sadness that lingers without explanation, or irritability that surprises you. Maybe it's a sense of emotional heaviness, a loss of enthusiasm, tears that come in moments that seem unrelated. So these reactions are not overreactions. They're unprocessed mourning. Your body is carrying what your mind has tried to rationalize away. And there's some terrible loneliness that comes from grieving alone. Grief is meant to be witnessed. But how do you explain that you're grieving a marriage that still exists? You may have spoke out about that in times past, but you may have been met with confusion. Your friends say, well, he's such a good provider, at least he's faithful. All marriages go through phases, okay? And then you begin to feel unreasonable for even hurting, and you may even just stop talking about it. And when grief has no witness per se, it becomes excruciatingly isolating. You're alone not only in the relationship, but in your mourning of it. Maybe we should talk about grieving the version of you that was emerging. There's another layer beneath the obvious loss. You're not only grieving the relationship you hoped for, you're grieving the version of yourself who believed she would be deeply known. The woman who imagined growing inside mutual emotional intimacy. The woman who thought her depth would be received and reflected. The woman who expected connection to expand over time. That imagined future shaped who you were becoming. And when that future quietly dissolves, part of your identity dissolves with it. That's real grief. Naming invisible grief requires honesty on your part. It requires admitting, okay, well, this is not what I thought it would be. And that sentence alone can feel very destabilizing, I know. Because once you name the loss, you can't unsee it. You may fear that acknowledging grief will push you toward decisions you aren't ready to make. That it will mean something definitive, that it will force action. Now, grief doesn't demand action, but it does require acknowledgement. So I would encourage you to let grief exist without making it a verdict, okay? One of the most important distinctions to hold on to is this. Grieving doesn't automatically mean leaving, It doesn't mean condemning the ASD husband. It doesn't mean rewriting your entire history as a mistake. Or, oh, if I'd only known then what I know now, I would have never done this. It simply means telling the truth about what hurts. You can grieve and still stay in the relationship. You can grieve without deciding anything. Grief is not a verdict, okay? Think of it as an emotional reckoning. Now, you may have wondered, well, what happens if I finally let myself feel it? Well, when grief is finally allowed, even quietly, it often softens. Not immediately, not completely, but the sharpness kind of dulls. And you may find that once you stop arguing with your sadness and allow yourself to feel what you really feel, it becomes less consuming, less frantic, less disguised as anger or self-blame. So grief, when acknowledged, integrates. It stops demanding attention through symptoms. Now, understand that invisible doesn't mean insignificant. Just because no one else sees your grief doesn't make it small. And just because nothing officially ended doesn't mean nothing was lost. The emotional life you hoped to live mattered. And the gap between hope and reality deserves compassion, not minimization. Now, this video was not meant to intensify your pain. It was meant to legitimize your pain. Because when grief is no longer invisible, even if only to you, it loses its power to distort everything else. It becomes something you carry without being crushed by it. And that's my hope for you in this video, that you will acknowledge your grief and no longer be crushed by it. If this resonates, please like and subscribe. Also, please comment. I love reading your comments and I will respond. Would you like to schedule a paid private coaching session? This will be in the form of a face-to-face Zoom call. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this Calendly link. If you click on that link, it'll open up my calendar. You can pick the available days and times that works for your schedule. You'll get a follow-up email immediately after purchasing a session that will have the Zoom link that coincides with the day and time that you picked. I will get an email too that you scheduled a session, and I will be available on that exact day and time, and we will talk. I look forward to working with you.